Hello and welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from California. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to those of you who support the podcast, whether financially by donating or subscribing to our Patreon, or if you've just followed this podcast, given a review, told a friend. It means a lot to me and to my life, and literally makes this podcast possible. I'm humbled and I'm incredibly grateful for you, so thank you. I recently listened to the book Nourishment by Fred Provenza, and I recommend it. However, I don't recommend listening to the audiobook because the recording cuts off the end of every chapter. It may only be about a paragraph that you missed, but it's that crucial last paragraph or so of every chapter, including the last one, so you don't even get to hear the final lines of the book. However, that glitch aside, which won't bother you if you read it rather than listen to it, it is a beautiful book. From interviews with Fred and how the book seems to be marketed, I thought it was going to be about grazing animals and Fred's studies and acquired understandings of how they feed themselves in a healthy ecosystem by eating a wide diversity of plants, etc. How this reflects on our modern industrial way of raising grazing animals. You know, this is what I had going into it. It's not about all that. I mean, it's sort of about that. It's sort of about Fred's observations and studies of grazing animals, yes, but only as a beginning. It's really a profound and personal spiritual journey. A kind of scientific memoir about how learning how animals care for themselves led Fred to begin to understand his role in the cycle of energy transformation that we call life. Very much in the same genre and plays in my heart as Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. Also, it has made me forever wary of any dietary advice, and instead made me want to learn how to be a better listener to my own body and environment and their ever-changing interactions and needs. Fred covers a lot of old wisdom in this book, but from within a new context that deepens the connections in our lives. I definitely felt nourished by reading Nourishment. Now, speaking of grazing and nourishment, these are two topics that I dig into with my guest for this episode, Ben Falk. If you don't know Ben, he's the author of The Resilient Farm and Homestead, 20 Years of Permaculture and Whole Systems Design, which I would describe as the homesteading manual, and is the result of decades of Ben's life in Vermont designing, implementing, and maintaining regenerative polyculture systems. Ben is very well known in the permaculture world, but isn't known so well in the wine world, which seemed a shame to me, as he has immense practical knowledge to share that would be useful to those of us growing wine. We cover many topics, as usual, in this conversation, from the state of the world to learning how to design your life to be able to better spend more time working in the land. And we get practical about many aspects of growing and maintaining fruiting perennials, which is my catch-all term for grapes, apples, pears, berries that we use to make wine. I've been thinking a lot about how owners of smaller vineyards can incorporate grazing, since larger ruminants like sheep and cows are difficult to keep in any significant numbers without a good bit of land. Ben loves working with cows more than sheep, as it turns out, and has some great suggestions about how to protect your fruiting perennials from them. But we also dig into geese, which are amazing grazers for smaller vineyards and orchards, and have their own nuances, as well as ducks, chickens, fencing, livestock, guardian dogs, and more. Also, in my comments in the episode with Jonathan Lundgren, which was the last episode, I said not to be surprised if I released a Terroir of Mead episode in the future. Well, the future has arrived. Ben has some beautiful things to say about mead making and has very much inspired me to consider mead making. If you haven't listened to John Lundgren's episode, it's pretty special, and I highly recommend it. I think a lot of folks overlook these episodes that don't have to do specifically with branded wineries and winemakers, grapes and grape winemaking. But these are some of the better ones. I've no dissing any of the other ones, but John Lundgren's episode and this one with Ben Falk, though they don't have a focus on grape winemaking, are some of the most inspirational and practical information you will ever get about how to actually practice regenerative wine growing, how to think about your role in wine growing, and the entire context of your farming that makes wine possible, whether from grapes, apples, honey, or all of the above. Ben asks us to consider resilience in our winemaking. What kind of wine growing and making can we continue to do indefinitely? What kind of wine makes our land continually healthier and more lush? What kind of winemaking makes our lives happier and more energetic? What kind of winemaking can continue to nourish us, regardless of the changing whims and trends of the wine market. I think you'll find that Ben has some great insights into answering these questions. Enjoy. All right, we're rolling. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for doing this. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Awesome. To start, could you say who you are and what you've been doing for the last 20 years and where you are?
Oh, I can try. Yeah, my name's Ben Falk, and I've been living in Vermont for about 25 years. I grew up in the suburbs, not doing really any of this stuff. Homesteading, small farming, growing lots of food and medicine, trying to regenerate land and develop a resilient land-based life and life approach. So it was all new to me. Well, really, when I got to college in the University of Vermont, took a permaculture course, took a course with John Todd, got to hang out with him a bunch, and really was inspired by people like him. Who he's a real father of the modern ecological design movement, with like Stuart Brand and Jay Baldwin, and kind of in the lines of like Buckminster Fuller, and just approaching
Hmm.
our lives from a design standpoint. Like how can we just actively do better, with our day-to-day actions, not just, resist the bad stuff in the world, like protest and wave flags and write letters, which, I still do from time to time. But, how do we actually, as Buckminster Fuller famously said, like, create a new system that renders the more destructive system obsolete, rather
Yeah,
than just resist and,
right.
fight something. How do we actually creatively create something, creatively manifest something else? So that's kind of the roots of it for me. And just, spending a lot of time outdoors. I was going to be a Knowles instructor and mountain guide for a long time before finding ecological design. I just want to live in a hands-on outdoor life. And so, kind of a land-based permaculture homestead approach just became my path. And
And
then I went to landscape architecture school, and after undergrad, and started a business actually before that called Whole Systems Design, and we do site planning for clients all over the country, sometimes out of the country, and especially in New England, who want to regenerate land, water, soil, produce food, while producing food usually, and also for schools and edible landscapes of all scales,
mm.
farms, learning landscapes, things like that. So
And you have developed a couple properties now. I mean, one that is a little, it's been a longer project than the other. Can you just
mhm.
sort of talk about the scale and scope of
Yeah,
what you've
right.
done?
So yeah, so my path has basically been to be on land. I got on our original site when I was 25, so very fortunate to be able to access land at a pretty young age, and that's 10 acres. And I'm here right now on these 10 acres, and been planting trees, and you know slowing, spreading, sinking water, making everything from rice paddies to swales to ponds, infrastructure systems, gravity feed water systems, wood fired hot water, and heat systems, cooking systems, etc. Anything we do to cycle resources on site in a more resilient and regenerative way for 21 years. And then our other site is about 11 years in, and that's larger. And we have cows there, and can do a little more of an agricultural site, whereas the original site is more of a steep hillside, kind of beat up old hillside, like a lot of New England is, a lot of the world is really not agricultural. And so that led to a more creative approach, by necessity. And yeah, both those sites are my main teacher, that's for sure. I've, as as you get experience, on land, you start kind of pushing your books to the sides of the shelves over time. I mean, I still read a lot, but you start believing your direct experience over and above, what you read, because it's just, it's true. So those have been my biggest sources of information, and understanding of inspiration of what's possible. And some of it's definitely conflicted with what I've read over, in the prior
Yeah.
10, 20, 30 years,
Well, and I want to bring up your book because during this time you wrote a book, which is I think a really valuable tool for anybody doing anything similar or considering doing anything similar that is pretty comprehensive in terms of the the number of things that you've tried. And what I love is you just came out with this new version, and it's funny. My wife is a librarian, so I was getting
Okay.
I got a copy from her, but it was the old version. So I started reading that, and then I finally ordered your book because I was like, I'm going to have this on my shelf, and I know I have to return the library book. And I got the new version, and it was very cool to see and compare the differences. And speaking to what you're talking about, learning from the land, it's like time as well. Like it seems like you've really um, I think this new version has this incredible depth of knowledge that you're sharing with everybody too about like, hey, I tried all these things. I wrote about them
Mm-hmm.
10 years ago. Now 10 years in, here are the results kind of thing.
Right.
Um, and going back to what you were saying, like one of my favorite things where I really got engaged um, beyond just like sort of skill stuff was this idea between being, a producer versus, a creator, a producer, where you sort of list like these various ways. And I feel like my whole life is that like how to move my life more in that direction, move away from just
Mm-hmm.
like buying organic food to growing my own food, or
Right.
whatever that's just a really simple thing, from like voting to getting involved in like local politics and helping to make change like at that level or whatever it is, like yeah. And I just thought that was a great element of it as well. You
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, and as I hear you talk and read your stuff, I think it's kind of funny that I see it's almost like you probably get this a lot where it's like permaculture is there's this fine line between it and like prepper culture.
Mm-hmm.
Do you hear that?
Yeah.
Why do
Yeah,
you
I think the line for me, it's a fine line, but I think for a lot of permaculture people, it's not. It's a solid line, and they're not into the prepping part. And then for a lot of prepping people, it's a fine line too, and it's really they're connected. I think they should be very connected. Being if by prepper we mean like a seriously resilient lifestyle that's hopefully can weather some pretty big societal adversities. Obviously, prepper has other connotations too, but that's kind of to me what the core of it should be. Um, but yeah, I think your average like liberal, use that term with in air quotes now, but like your average kind of liberal permaculture person is like doesn't want to be part of that what they think of that as all at all. But I do think there's tons of connections and necessary connections.
Well, and it makes it like one of the first questions I wanted to ask you as we get into this, but just to set the stage was like, can you sort of give your take on where we are in history right now? Just like, what do you
Hmm.
see as the reason for the sort of societal things that we're dealing with right now, and
Yeah.
cultural,
Well,
societal,
it's funny.
environmental? Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting you're asking this right now because I was just out of Vermont for a week and I was in the megalopolis. I was in
Mm,
Connecticut and New Jersey, southern Connecticut,
yeah.
and and what is most of Jersey, but I was in eastern Jersey, in the heart
Yeah.
of Jersey, and so I'm actually reeling from that trip. I mean, I hadn't spent a week in the megalopolis in a while, and you can kind of forget about it in Vermont, at least in rural Vermont, which is most of it. You really kind of forget, especially if you ignore a lot of the so-called news, which I try to,
Hmm.
and my wife does very, very well. You kind of just forget that how crazy things still are and how dysfunctional things still are. I mean, there's still I went through neighborhoods where it's still pretty much every other person at least is spraying pesticides on their turf grass to maintain like a perfect turf yard.
Right.
And, things like that where you're just like, wow, like I figured we weren't doing that anymore. You just figured like how could that still be happening? Like just from a cancer perspective alone, like obviously cancer keeps
Right.
getting worse every year, and you just figure you figure we've woken up to like the lowest hanging fruit of let's do what we can that's at least easy to reduce cancer rates, and like spraying our lawn would be one of those. But no, it's like not at all, and so many things like that. That I just stunning, just completely, just a shock to the system to see. And like, wow, like we're actually digging the whole faster than when I grew up in those environments. I mean, I'm from the suburbs. Like, people sprayed their yards so they didn't have any dandelions, in the grass, even though it
Right.
contributes to like their likelihood of getting cancer. Just like crazy stuff. But that's normal, and it's normal in this country, in more well-off neighborhoods, I should say. I mean, it's not normal in a lot of the world, but we're in a pretty extreme situation here in the United States, and so that's good news that it's not so common around the world to that extreme. But yeah, that cultural, if you can call it that, but that kind of industrial pop culture life way is it's kind of going harder than ever, really, and it's still as impossible as it ever was, and it's always been impossible. It's always been based on an idea that the resources are infinite and the costs, and we don't have to count the costs, and somehow there'll just be clean enough water and air to survive, and and no problems with producing food, and getting the basic resources, having the grid on, and all the other things that are incredibly vulnerable. So I guess I feel like this kind of situation could limp on for longer, at least for those who can afford it. But it has to break. We know, if there's one thing you can bet on, is that it just from a resource perspective alone, it's just not a viable situation. And so, kind of planning for breaks in the system, whether they're short or longer or both. We got to see COVID had elements of the COVID event. I know, not the virus itself, but the whole event that became the response, and the economic event that it was, showed us quite clearly, what the kind of ratcheting down of functionality of industrial society will look like, but in a mild version. And it's not, there's nothing really cool about it. I mean, it's not going to be like, oh, well, we'll just all grow our food, and it's going to be it has its dark sides, and I don't know. I think but I don't want to harbor I'm a bit of a collapsnik, so to speak, but I also think we could just be in this like downward trend of mainly seeing health declines.
Yeah.
But still, like, the stores still have food, and like the system itself still looks like it's functioning for decades longer. Assuming some very specific things don't happen, which are very more likely every year.
Right.
But I think the biggest, symptoms of it are just our health, more than, like, we're not starving in the United States for the most part, but we're like, overfed and undernourished, and like chronically ill. And so it's manifesting in these other ways that in the past, it would manifest in people dying of starvation when things collapse, or whatever, things like that. But now it's almost like eating us from the inside. And we're now, I think this is the 4th or 5th year in a row of reduced life expectancy in the United States. Like, we peaked, basically so many things peaked in 2019. Peter Zeihan, I forget how you pronounce it, but he's a great author. You may have heard of him. And he is known, among others too, for just really clearly explaining how 2019 will be looked at as like the peak of like functional globalization, if you can call it that. And that we'll kind of never get that level of the machine working that well again. And now we're just kind of in this ratcheting down. And I think he's, we'll see, but so far he's right. And the COVID event kind of precipitated that, but it was part of so many other things too.
Yeah. So much of like what I suggest for people who are thinking about starting, whether it's a vineyard or orchard or, farm of any kind, is like, try to build with the sense of like, how do you operate it without fossil fuels? Like, what are you going to do in the absence of, in that kind of a world? Not necessarily that you might die before that happens, but that will
might
happen.
Also just be really economically advantageous,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Utterly necessary. Yeah.
Well, thank you for giving that sort of big picture look at it. I know this is a lot of why you're concerned with resiliency, and your book is all about that. And like the underlying themes are that. That's why I wanted to say that, which is like,
Mhm.
behind this uncertainty is this designing your life for resiliency.
Mhm.
Um, you have a lot of great stuff to say about it. And I mean, things like, one of your cool principles is like resilience equals diversity times redundancy times connectivity times manageability. And I've
Mhm.
actually we've been talking about that in the vineyard as we've been working here, just this idea of like how manageability is seldom, I don't know, it's like one of those sort of left out things. Like some of the other ones we always talk about with regenerative agriculture is like diversity and connectivity, but then the redundancy is like, oh yeah, like that actually you need that, right, for systems. And then
Mhm.
manageability, it's like, yeah, if I can't, like, if I you have this great thing where you're talking about like the energy input, and the fact that you age is like like you're always going to be fighting this losing battle, because your energy is always going to be decreasing, and your ability to
Mhm.
manage a system. And so thinking
Mhm.
about that, it's really interesting.
Mhm.
You and then just to contextualize it within, you know, wine, I love that right at the beginning of the book on like page 24, there's this great photo of like booze filled carboys. And the caption is distilling summer's energy. And yeah, I mean, in the context of all these things that like, just lay the groundwork for, where do you see,
Mhm.
fermentation fitting in, like, and these fermented beverages that you make,
Yeah.
and especially on a farm? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's kind of like it's a little bit of icing on the cake. There's a reason it wasn't in the first book, 10 years into this experiment in living.
Yeah.
And it is, once I was 20, 19, 20, 21 years in. It's kind of like I wouldn't necessarily start with that. And I didn't start with that. But after you're planting and planting for years and years, and keeping bees, and slowly getting, I think, better at keeping bees, although that's like more difficult than anything else in
Well,
the book or
I
anything else
want to
I've done.
I want to talk to you about that actually,
Yeah,
but
we can
keep
chat
going,
about
keep
that.
going.
It's not
Yeah.
it's just basically nearly impossible sometimes, it feels. But doing, yeah, all that, so the fruit starts bearing, the berries and the larger fruits, and you start getting a lot of honey. And even without the honey, just the ciders, the apples alone in this part of the world. I mean, you don't even need to plant for those, because we're in wild apple kingdom. I mean, apples are a
Right.
weed. I say weed in that they're volunteer. There's probably a million apples in this county I'm in right now that no one ever planted. It's an
Right.
amazing center of diversity for apples. They love it here. And so basically over time, you realize, well, pretty quickly after just 5 to 8 years, I can't eat all this fruit. I don't want to eat all this, try to eat all this fruit. I give some away. We have friends, neighbors come over. I'm not really in the business of trying to sell fruit, like just to harvest it all and try to sell it. Like, I'm not going to quit my day job to do that. Um, they don't keep very well on the shelf, but to
Right.
ferment it and make something that's as enjoyable as like a really kind of high vibration booze, so to speak.
Mm.
And then that's something that gets better over time versus has the opposite of a short shelf life, is pretty magical. Like, turn this raw material that essentially would just go bad, within the week, to something that's better in year 2 and better in year 4 and 5 and 8. It's pretty neat, and also just is such a special thing to take, in the body. Um, yeah, that just became an eventuality. I never, planned to make mead or cider. Never sat out. Never really occurred to me as like, yeah, I want to get into that, because I'm not much of a drinker. It's a big part of it. Like,
Right. Right.
I literally probably had like 50 or 100 drinks in all 4 years of college. Like, I just, I mean, I'm not opposed to it. I just, I have close friends who are, I once figured I'd spent $50,000 less than a lot of my friends at this point in my life than they have on booze.
Yeah.
And
Oh God.
I think they're pretty normal, honestly. But I'm just not a big drinker. And so, yeah, it didn't occur to me, but I was just kind of, if you will, forced into it by trying to, figure out how do I preserve and add value to the things that are resulting from our land. And
Yeah.
that's where I got into cider, and I hesitate to use the term meads because meads usually are kind of sweet, and I don't really like most meads. Anytime I bought a mead, except once, I honestly didn't even like it. Sometimes
Yeah.
I try to choke it down, honestly. So if you're a listener who's like, "Oh, meads, that's not so cool," I'm not talking about normal meads here. It's more like a sparkling honey champagne
Yeah.
would be a way to think of it. I mean, generally not still, dry, like not sweet, and
Yep.
usually sparkling, like kind of like a sharp cider, but with all sorts of, dozens of other fruits and especially flowers and herbs. Those are our favorites, like the methaglins, I guess they would be called. The best ones, the best drinks we've ever made are with flowers and honey, and actually not
Oh.
even really with fruit for the most part.
Oh, so you add the flowers in during the fermentation.
Initial, yeah. So
Yeah.
it's really so simple. I mean, you're making basically a cold infusion. It's just making a tea, flower
Yeah.
tea, 70
Oh.
degrees, whatever it might be in your house at the time. Usually it's spring and summer.
You use that to
And you
dilute
just pull that
the
stuff.
the honey.
What's that?
And you use that to dilute the honey when you go to ferment.
Yeah, so then you just mix up honey and water, and then that infusion, whatever the herbs are, put it in a 5-gallon crock, and put a towel over the top with a rubber band, and pull it out with a slotted spoon before it starts to rot, which is usually like 4 days, 5 days if it's cooler out. And then you could go
Oh.
a little longer in that primary fermentation, till it's starting to really bubble a bit, and then go right into the carboy, filter a little, maybe lightly through a stainless steel screen, not very fine, and then it's in the carboy for months, and then you bottle it when it clears up. Really pretty simple stuff, and it makes, like, with the honey, you really want to wait a year, as most people will say for mead. But then it just gets better and better and better. And year two is even twice as good as year one, or like
Mm.
5 times better than year one. And then it just gets incrementally better from there. Just gets totally dry, all worked out, like no heat. The heat all goes away from it. Any of the kind of alcohol-y, like, heat that's in it totally is massaged out, and you get this very, like, up type of effect. Like, it's much more like in the, it's like the top of your head. It's not booze, it's not, or especially
Yeah.
not beer. Like, it's not like it's almost really not a depressant, as far as, like,
Mm.
its effect. It's very high. There's a reason mead is like the marriage, like, drink of, like, kind of ecstatic type of beverage. It's the honey has a certain energy to it, and or vibration, if you will, and it's just a really happy kind of top of the crown chakra type of, like, thing. And yeah, it's
I
really
love
neat.
that.
Doesn't I get none of like, I don't drink. I mean, I've probably drank 5 beers in the last 5 years, and like a good beer, I'll drink, if I had like a big ski day or something. But it's like, I have no interest in once we make our own beverages like this. um
Yeah.
it's like
How about a
it
Coors
feels like
Light?
I'm making like an infusion with grain, like a glyphosated grain
Right.
infusion.
Exactly. Exactly.
I'm not interested in that.
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and the effect is also, analogous to how it's produced.
Right. Yeah. That is, yeah. Well, that sounds really beautiful.
It's really a special thing. I mean, we first, my wife really first kind of got me into it just following what Sandor Katz does in his Art of Fermentation. He has like a 1-page, recipe, and that's kind of really the basis of how we
Oh,
went
beautiful.
about it.
And so
She's an
you're,
herbalist, my wife, so she kind of tends to just actually. I've moved into it in the last 5 years, coming up with a lot of my own. I don't want to call them recipes because they're never going to be the same from year to year. It's more like, look at the autumn berry flowers right now. Like, the plant is vibrating with pollinators. Let's harvest some of those flowers and put them in the crock and get that essence, into a beverage. So it's just based on what's totally going off, at its highest expression seasonally.
right. That's
But
nice.
she
I can imagine.
originally would kind of be very sensitive to what those plants are that are at their apogee of like life force, whether it's herbs like yarrow or white clover, red clover, flowers, especially flowers,
Mm.
black locust blossoms. I mean, you name it, autumnberry flower, um, bee balm, echinacea, even milkweed flower, black currant leaf, oak leaves have been in some of our brews. Sometimes we'll combine a lot of different things. One last summer, I made a sparkling dry honey champagne that I just went out and collected every flower, one of like, or 5 or 20 of every type of flower I could find in like height of summer, like late July. So I lost track, but I think there was like 30 different flowers in this brew, and I called that high summer cross section. And it's a special one. It still needs a little more time, but it's going to be very, very special. It's already really good, but it needs to age some more.
That sounds
Um,
lovely. And are
yeah.
you, yeah, so you with the, I mean, one of the advantages of working with honey is you could brew any time of the year, right? I mean, you can just plan it
Yeah. I
for
tend
whenever
to
you.
make everything in most of it with the fresh herbs and fruit, but yeah, the honey is available. You know, honey doesn't go bad. So I'll bottle condition, like I'm bottle conditioning batches from last year growing
Right.
season now, last 2 months with the honey at bottling time to get a because I like a carbonated. I generally don't want almost any of it to be totally still like a wine. I like at least like a 2 to 5 point bubble somewhere in there, like a
Hmm.
crackling sparkle. Um, for the most part, although the really good stuff, like this, the best batches I'm happy with if they're still. But like I feel like a sparkle kind of makes an okay batch like still really good because it's like refreshing
Yeah.
and it kind of
Yeah.
hides, it changes it. But
But
too
yeah.
much sparkle and I feel like you really kind of overwhelms the mouth feeling. You don't really get to taste all the essences of what flowers and blossoms are in there. But
So how are you doing the sparkle? Well, first of all, you're not inoculating, right? Like with yeast, you're not adding yeast, or are you adding yeast?
I started to add bought yeast a little here and there if the batch tastes a little funky. But
Oh yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
more with that's more with the ciders. I
Yeah.
really have generally just used wild fermentation. Yeah, I'm not pretty much, especially with the meads or whatever we want to call them. I'm really not pitching a bought yeast. We have, and we've definitely pitched a premier or a classique yeast, a champagne yeast here and there, but I'd
Yeah.
say like a tenth of the time. And then even with the ciders, I rarely pitch a yeast. Last year I tried a bit, and it's not resulting in a better outcome necessarily. So I don't think I think I'm right back off of that. Um,
And are
I
you bottle?
generally
Oh,
though it's easy to end up with like a pretty Brettanomyces like forward brew that's just like a little bit more sour than I like, and
mhm.
so that's why I started trying to pitch some yeast. But what I find is if you're just really clean about the whole thing, you definitely don't have to have the Brettanomyces, dominant
Right.
vibe. But when I say clean, I mean like I don't use any chemical cleaners. Like it's funny, all the books I have, I don't follow, so much of what's in the books. Like I basically will dishwasher my bottles, but I don't do anything else. Like I pour hot water in the carboy, I shake it around, I rinse it like 5 times, I store them dry, like in between uses, and like that's it. Like I'm not sterilizing anything,
Yeah.
and but I try to keep my hands real clean, and especially as things get further along, I try to be just very cognizant of what I'm touching, and because you can contaminate it pretty easily.
Yeah. And you're bottling in like swing tops or with like bottle cap bottling for the
I was
pressure?
doing all swing tops, but it was getting too expensive.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Quickly, I maybe I got up to about spending like maybe my $500 on swing top bottles, and I'm like, this I can't keep doing this, and so I bought a pallet from Quebec of like 1,200, crown, 29 millimeter crown, 500 milliliter
That's
heavy
funny. So
bottles
did
that contain.
I.
What's that?
We probably bought from the same company. I was trying to look
Yeah,
for
yeah, yeah.
like
It worked out great. I thought it was going to take me like half my rest of my lifetime to go through the palette, and I'm already actually like 7/8 of the way through the palette
that's
because I made
yeah.
so much cider last year because we had a bonkers apple year. But yeah, so I'm
No.
pretty much bottling almost everything in these Crown, 500 milliliter. What my wife and I realized was the 750 ml. We just like we would. That's just a bit much for us to open at dinner, and it was like
Oh,
the
so you got
bottom.
500s.
Yeah, we got 500s, and then it's
That's
like we
brilliant.
finish it every time, no problem. But we rarely want to open a second. I mean, between just her and I, we don't open a second. If friends are over, we could open two or three. But the 750s, it was like there was always a couple inches that we weren't
Yeah.
necessarily immediately downing. So then it would warm up, and then you put it in the fridge, and it's not so good the next day. So it's just like, let's just do 500s.
Yeah. No, I seriously thought about doing all my stuff in 500s as well. Like I interviewed a bunch of people and it
Mm.
depends on who you interview. Some people be like, no, you should go to leaders. It's
I
like,
know. I
okay.
mean, yeah,
I was like,
I
personally,
have
I
a great
like the
time.
500. Yeah. Yeah. Me
Yeah.
too.
But and you can
um,
always open lots of them, and I'll bring them to friends' houses, and they send me home with the bottles. So I should have that palate for a long time, but
yeah.
um, I do
That's
like
great.
the glass, the clear swing tops. I like the clear glass to see the brew too sometimes. So I
Yeah.
sometimes forget, but I try to put every batch in a couple clear swing tops, and then 90% of it's going in the amber 500 milliliter, and so I can see each one and have like each batch laid out on a shelf and see. Maybe I've done like 30 different batches in the last 2 years, and so I could like see each one.
Nice. Now you said you had a big crop of apples last year. I mean, a lot of New England was decimated. What?
You're right.
Why?
I
Why
know.
did
It's
you get
very
apples?
interesting. It's total. All the commercial orchards had like, one of their worst years. I mean, it was 19 degrees Fahrenheit, not Celsius, on our
Yeah.
farm on May 16th or 19th. Well, it was full blossom. Like everything was in
Yeah.
blossom. It was the middle of May. And, according to every university, paper on the topic, it's like 100% crop failure at that point. I mean, basically about 25 on down. It's like you're not, 90% failure at a 27 or whatever it is. So you weren't supposed to have any apples. And the bloom was like nothing a lot of people had seen here. And I mean, the flowering last spring was just insane. And I feel like the energy of the plants or China fruit were just like, whatever, okay, it's 19 degrees. And the fruit, basically, it thinned the fruit, but we got a huge year. I mean, truckloads of
Wild.
apples you could collect in a couple hours. And and I think that's in the hills though. So we're in the mountains, and
Yeah.
where a lot of the apples were even collected from. I mean, I've got Gold Rush and some varieties that are fruiting that I planted, but a lot of what we collected from are 50-year-old wild trees all over the place on our farm and off. And I think they're just more resilient genetics. And I think also being in the mountains, I want to say helps it, but they were in full blossom. It's not like we were a week behind, and we are a
Right.
week behind the valleys, but we were still in full blossom. So like it was the worst time for that freeze, and there shouldn't have been any apples, but there was tons of tons. There was millions of tons of apples in the mountains of
Huh.
Vermont.
Wild.
Um, so yeah, so I just felt like I had to. I felt like the crop was particularly special. So I made like maybe I made 70 gallons. What I make? I made like 12, 12 6.5 gallon carboys, and then I made like five other smaller batches. So for me, that's a lot. Like I put a lot of
Right.
hours into it. I'm
Yeah.
only using glass carboys. Like I have no interest in buying wooden casks and doing like full like larger batches or stainless. So it's just a lot
Yeah.
of carboys.
Nice. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I want to dig into a bunch of things with you, so I'm gonna just
Yeah.
jump around here. But I mean, in permaculture, as a permaculturist, you're thinking a lot about passive energy, use and storage and things like that. So in terms of designing like a house, or I mean, in this case, I'm thinking more about a wine cellar. I'm imagining, obviously, we want to use the earth, we want to get underground. But have you built anything specifically for your stuff? Have you done that? I mean, you've talked about like having a part of your house that's like a root cellar kind of thing for passive cold storage, right? Like
Hmm.
a pantry.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have talked about root cellars, quite at length, and they're crucial, I think. And yeah, wine cellar is kind of a similar type of endeavor. You use an earth sheltered space, but I think generally aiming towards really as dry as possible. You don't really need any humidity in there, and you certainly don't want too much. So I've retrofitted basically bottom floors of buildings to be like a quote unquote wine cellar, but really all it is like walkout basement situation where it stays pretty
Gotcha.
cool. Never
Yeah.
never gets above, call it 65, and doesn't get below about 45. And I'm sure it could be engineered and I could use active energy input to have it more ideal, but it works perfectly fine
Yeah.
with no active energy. Just, I'm not heating or cooling it.
So this is already pre-existing space, because I was kind of going to ask about
Yes,
like if
exactly.
you,
It's all pre-existing. So
yeah, I was like, I was curious if you'd considered, doing an underground anything and what is involved in that, or do you have to bring in outside inputs, or is there a way in like a wet climate like yours to build
Mhm.
a cellar without, getting like whatever the things that you would use to seal a basement or whatever in
Mhm.
modern
I
construction?
mean, I would tend to just use a lot of drainage, and yeah, I would make basically a full, make a full basement and drain it as much as possible, and don't shy
Right.
away from foundation, sealant. Water. The groundwater table gets pretty high here on most sites in the winter and spring. So,
Yeah.
make sure it's a very dry basement, and it'll be a good wine cellar as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty straightforward, honestly. That's not the hard part about any of this. But if you're like live in a house on a slab and there's no under earth berm space, then obviously but I think it could be harder. But I still think like the brews I make, I don't think they're going to be that much worse for the wear if they're up in the 65, 70 degrees during the summer a bit. I mean, I could be wrong over time. I could learn that's not the case. And there's a reason people have wine cellars, of course. I had not one batch. I had like 5 batches last year, almost 2 years ago now, that I left on germination mats to bottle condition, and I
Mhm.
lost track of what was happening. I got busy, and I put a sleeping bag over the top because I just thought the whole thing was going to be like at about 65 from the germination mats, like regular gardening germination mats. And after about a week and a half, I checked it a day or two later and it was fine. But then I went down like a week later, 2 weeks later, and the whole thing was like at 85 to 90 degrees. Basically, those batches were like heated to like 90 for like a week or two,
Oh
85.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
they were fine to drink. They actually aged quick. And I had like a
Yeah.
finished cider that felt like it was 2 years old in like 4 months,
Huh.
and or maybe a year old in 4 months. So I think it just sped up the time. I mean, sure, you could
Yeah.
ruin your brew that way too, but yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting.
And you're not using sulfites, or are you using
No,
sulfites?
no, I've never used any sulfites.
Yeah. And you've grown some grapes too, right? I mean, I know you haven't grown
Barely.
like
I
you're
mean,
trying to grow a vineyard.
it's about the thing I've grown the least, so that's why I was chuckling when I got your email originally, because here's a guy from, the vineyard world, and like I've grown lots of stuff, but grapes pretty much not one. I mean, I've maybe planted a few varieties, but because they take a trellis, it's just a whole nother step. And so I just focus on like everything else. It doesn't take, same with kiwis. Like I really never focused on kiwis because they take a trellis, or Cassandra berry, all these things I'd like to do more of, but it's just that whole nother step of training them that I would like to grow more grapes, especially as I'm now more into fermenting. But yeah, I don't consider myself like as someone who's really tried
I'm
grape for.
you'll find out about me. I'm not that into trellises either, which is why I want to do vines and trees. That's what I'm
Cool.
interested in doing, since that's how they
Yeah.
evolved as well. I mean, this is their
Right.
partnership
Right.
for years. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do that too, and I want to explore them and see. Yeah, there's obviously challenges, but yeah,
Yeah.
very
No,
curious.
I mean, our original site is filled with wild grapevines that go up in trees. And
Right.
I do harvest those grapes. I nibble on them, but I've never actually put them in my brew, which I'd like to.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just funny. Grapes, yeah, it's like the kind of there's so many other berries and fruits that I work with. It's like, oh yeah, grapes are good too. You know?
Yeah. I mean, and have you fermented have you fermented, like, because I know you're big into sea berries and
Yeah,
like elderberry
yeah.
and stuff like that. Have you fermented those as well?
Oh yeah, yeah. We've pretty much put most anything that you know of, that you've seen listed in my book. We've pretty much put it in a mead, in a sparkling kind of honey champagne thing. But
Nice.
my
Okay.
favorite ones, sea berry is actually not one of them. We've had some good sea berry batches, but never great.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of really good black currant batches. Like black currant
Ooh.
is a queen of fermentable
Yeah,
fruit.
I
It's just,
totally agree with you on that. One of my favorite
it
wines I had
holds.
recently, yeah, it was blackcurrant with blueberry and I think blackberry or something like that. But it was, yeah.
Ooh, that's what I have. I have the triple black. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I have a blueberry, blackberry, blackcurrant batch right now. A couple of them in there. It's really good. Yeah, blackberry is very good in a brew. Um, but yeah, blackcurrant. There's the tanniny kind of sharper stuff.
Yeah.
Aronia too,
Oh yeah.
and they're so easy to grow. I mean, blackcurrant are too, but if anything's easier than blackcurrant, it's aronia. And then chokecherry. We're getting way into chokecherry, which is like a truly, like, I don't like the term native, but it's a wild, volunteer voracious shrub, small tree that grows all over on like very poor dry sites, and it really makes a great ferment.
Oh, that's good to know. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I love your thing about like native to when, the question that you ask.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so one of the things that you have a ton of experience with is grazing with animals and building soil with animals, which is like a huge part of what's in vogue with the regenerative viticulture movement here in California. We see sheep
Hmm.
and vineyards all over. I mean, it's not just in vogue. I mean, it's a fantastic thing. Like I fully swear, I run sheep here almost every
Yeah.
day. I'll take care
Awesome.
of the sheep that we use in the vineyard here. But you've worked with many more than sheep, and this came up in a recent. We had a regenerative wine growing immersion here a few weeks back, and one of the things that became clear is like once you understand these principles of how grazing build soil health, like eliminates adds work, but also eliminates a lot of other work that you would do and creates this circular energy in the system.
Hmm.
It's like a no-brainer, like it all clicks into place. However, if your vineyard's only like 5 acres, it's kind of hard to run sheep through it, like you
Hmm.
you you can do 4 sheep, but then it's like what do you do with them after, it's like it
Right.
becomes a little bit of a thing.
There's
So
a critical mass of having an animal.
right, right,
Yeah, and especially with
um
cows, like, one
right, a
cow
cow,
needs
right.
a lot of land, and you kind of don't want to have one of anything. So, yeah.
Right, right. And so that was the thing, was like thinking about what some of the alternatives could be in a smaller space. I mean, you were working on 10 acres and you've tried a whole bunch of stuff. And so, I would just wanted to
Hmm.
get your, I mean, I would love to go through some of the various animals that you've used, but just, what you've learned from your experimentations doing this and,
Yeah.
what you can share. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky question, and, it's just a management challenge, like you said. I mean, I'm in year 4 now or something of keeping cows, and I love having beef, and their impact on the land is really amazing. But they've destroyed untold numbers of my trees, um,
Right.
because if you just lapse in the management, with the animal pressure, like, you can really lose trees really quickly, and so kind of turns the stress level up a bit, because if you just have your trees out there, your berries, it's like, get behind, okay, I've got a taller sward that I need to mow and deal with, of grass, but it's not like stuff is killing my trees every day. I'm losing, tons of material, of plant material, to like large herbivores. And so, it's I totally get the challenge of it. I've both gained and lost from having animals, but if you're on it with management and can keep them moving. I mean, it depends on the animal, of course, but even a small sheep will do some serious damage to most plants that you can grow, woody plants, whether it's a grapevine or even a full-on apple tree. They have teeth and they like chewing bark. And most of them will eventually chew bark super hard. I mean, there's varieties to consider, but I've had it's hard to try lots of those. So I've never experimented with, more than a handful of different types of each animal. And our cows, we've only had really one breed. Um, and they love to chew on trees. So they're probably easier cows, but it's an expensive proposition to start trying different cow breeds. Yeah, it's a fencing challenge, by and
Yeah,
large. Um,
gotcha.
and so planting in rows, of course, and just, basically designing everything to make ease of movement and ease of fencing be like your main deal. I would say
Right.
is like probably the lowest hanging fruit and most key. And
Ben,
then there's also an age thing, like on
co-
our original site, like the plant material was too small to keep trying to keep sheep off of. So I finally gave up on sheep for a few years to let the trees and everything get bigger so it could take a little bit of grazing pressure or a bit versus like barely any and be wrecked.
right.
So you
Can
kind of have to get, are you talking about like bring sheep and in a new orchard or new vineyard, or, you've got a 10-20 year old head start, 10-20 years head start with the woodies, and then bring the animals in. That's a better situation all in all, I think.
I bet. So, yeah, I mean, I'd love to dig into like if you were didn't have that 20-year or 10-year head start, you were trying to get things started and building soil health while also growing your orchard or vineyard or whatever it was that you're fruiting perennials. So you
Mhm.
have young fruiting perennials. Are sheep and cows maybe not the best option? Are there other better options for grazing?
I mean, I've only worked with sheep and cows. I mean, I think well, I've also worked with chickens and geese and some other stuff too. But geese are geese are awesome. I mean, geese are like they're not going to mess with the woody part of the plant, and they're barely even going to mess with any part of like a woody plant, even the leaves, um, depending. But there's a reason that geese were used in these systems for a long time, and they fell on out of favor. I think partly that's just a culinary issue, but we once ran 100 geese in the beginning establishment year or two of some of our larger silvopasture hedgerows uh, in agroforestry system, and that was pretty amazing because they will go through and eat the grass and not
Right.
touch the woodies. Like it's like the what you would want to wave a magic wand and be like, just eat everything on the ground and don't touch these woodies.
They will do
Um,
it.
they will, like they're truly grazers, but like very very light touch grazers.
Hmm.
Um, the issue is processing geese is kind of a lot of work. They're great until they're about 6 months old, and then they become like their own nation, and that they're very opposed to human beings. It seems like once they get like, their energy going, and which is kind of fun, but also a little bit of a pain. Um,
They're kind of
they like
jerks.
get angry with people once they
Yeah.
get to a point, it seems. And so that's one thing. The processing is more time because like plucking geese. I don't know if commercial pluckers work well, but like the processing's a lot of work for geese, I think is what people have found. I know
Right.
someone in Vermont who was like, they realized the possibilities and like, well, let's just make a market like geese needs to be on the menu again.
Right.
Goose.
Right.
And they did it for a couple years, but they're not doing it anymore. So they ran into some challenge with that. I don't think they did it after a couple years. Um, but that's maybe like the ideal creature in the understory. Especially if you can like mow the grass every now and then, because once things get coarse, they're not a true
Yeah, like ruminant.
ruminant exactly.
Yeah.
Well, they can't deal with like anything that's not very succulent. But if you keep the pressure on enough and you add some mechanical pressure, disturbance, you could keep it the way geese do. A lot of
Okay.
grazers would say, "Hey, that's ridiculous. Geese don't build soil like large animals," and they're probably right. Although there's the whole aquaculture concept and practice out of New Zealand, and apparently some parts of Asia, where Hakai Tani is this guy that people follow in New Zealand that I met years ago when I was traveling there. And the big thought in that movement is that geese actually are like the best animal for land because they have no compaction ability. Like they don't compact the soil. But
Right.
all the modern, like, hardcore soil farm, carbon farming grazers that I know are like, no, like you need the weight to press in the organic matter. And that's a big part of what builds the soil. And so I don't know, but I do
Right.
see that point for sure. Like, um, let me turn off my messaging here. So that is something I've seen from, I closed you. Um, Sorry. I don't know how to turn off my iMessage on my laptop, but it should be off. Um, now my email's coming in. So yeah, geese are awesome, especially for the establishment phase. Maybe when stuff gets bigger, like the smallest cow you could possibly find with the most ginger appetite, for woodies possible. Um,
Yeah.
in some ways, like more of an industrial breed actually can make the most sense. And I know it sounds really weird, but like the more like high, like old school heirloom breeds that are used to like forage, like woody forage. I mean, they go like my cows like my trees sometimes as much as the grass.
Right. Right. So you
So,
want,
which is a good, that's like great for like where maybe they've lived for hundreds and hundreds of years and evolved, but like I don't want that. So
right.
yeah, it's
That's
kind of
funny.
interesting. Like there are like more like industrialized breeds that would be like, I'm not touching a tree. I need like perfect grass, and so like that might be the one you want. And I know that sounds totally weird, but yeah, I mean, generally the littler the animal and the less prone they are, of course, to browsing,
Yeah.
the better. But it might be a weird type of a breed you wouldn't think it would be.
Now I thought you had some good things to say about ducks and chickens too. How do they do for you?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So ducks and chickens, I've liked, especially ducks, but not as far as like understory management for woody plants like we're
Okay.
talking about. They're
Gotcha.
they're not grazers.
Right.
Despite all the pastured poultry, labeling, like poultry
You have
aren't
to,
supposed to be in pastures. Poultry are supposed to be in understories of jungles. It's like, it's
right.
just fun. When you see pastured poultry, it's like, okay, that's nice for the poultry if someone's feeding them, but they can't eat a pasture. They're not
Right.
grazing animals. They'll eat bugs if they're in with cows. Great, they'll find some worms, but they still need like major supplement. So
Right.
they don't consume grass.
Right.
At least any type of chicken I've ever had, meat, leg, you name it. I mean, they need bugs. They want woody debris, like leaf litter. They're jungle fowl from the tropics, So, yeah, they're not a ruminant, but geese are almost a ruminant, in bird form.
Right.
And ducks, same thing as chickens. Like they're not going to eat much grass, if any. So, they
I
can't
feel like
manage an understory.
maybe you can confirm or disconfirm this, but I feel like geese would be good for cleaning up drops too. Like if you had a persimmon tree or something like that, they would be like a
Sure.
vacuum for
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
right?
definitely, and chickens too, and I think breaking pest cycles and stuff. Sure, that's all great, but I guess I've narrowed down your question to my biggest problem, which isn't cleaning up stuff and breaking pest cycles, although it is important for some people. It's keeping the jungle back that's coming up in the understory,
Right. Right.
and that's
Yes.
where
So
just
what
chickens and ducks just can't keep up.
and so if you're going to use sheep or cows, you're going to need to keep an eye on them and think about your fencing when you're installing the
Yeah.
whatever the
Hmm.
system is. Like you better put it in a way where you
Yeah.
can fence them out
You
from
need to
those trees in a way.
strategically have some hot wires in there. And that's why I moved to cows, in part because I moved to a larger scale or added a larger scale, but also I was sick of moving netting, and like sheep, you could train sheep to respect a couple strands, but not generally one strand so easily. Whereas
Yeah, we
cows
do two
easily
here.
respect
Yeah,
one
we do two strands here. Yeah.
two strand, yeah, and that's great. But cows one strand keeps them in,
Right.
so like
Right.
that's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, and you haven't played with pigs or goats. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, not much. I've had some.
Okay.
I've had both of them briefly, and I love goats, but they're even more wily than sheep and prone to getting to ignoring your fencing and pigs. I don't like pigs just personally. It's just like a personal thing. I'm just not into. I don't kind of vibe with them. But if you had to do a serious land disturbance, then that's great. But you generally don't want a lot of like excavation near your woody plants.
Right, right.
And
Yeah.
pigs are diggers and stuff. So,
Yeah.
and again, they're not grazers, as far as I understand. I haven't kept pigs much, but pretty sure
There are
they're
a couple
not. They're
breeds.
not a
Yeah,
grazing animal, kind of like a chicken in that way.
well, it brings up something because there are a couple breeds like the Kuni Kunis and the American Guinea pigs
Yeah,
are
yeah,
pretty good grazers, and
interesting.
like can live. I mean, they'll get
I've heard
fat on
that.
just grazing. Yeah, from what I mean, I haven't personally seen that, but I know now multiple people and have talked to
Yeah, I
people
know
who.
people who are into those breeds. I guess I never realized they really are like full on grass eaters.
Yeah, yeah, they'll get fat, like squeezed, like their eyes squeeze shut. Is the way my
Just
this
on
one guy
grass? That's amazing.
just on grass. Yeah, the Kuni
I
Kunis
mean,
especially.
yeah.
They just yeah
But they
as long as
also
you keep
have
them
a
moving.
trickier fencing need, right? Like usually people keep pigs in like netting too.
Yeah, and Kuni Kunis are not as crazy as like the Berkshires and the big the ones that like you get them as piglets and then you're slaughtering like in under eight
Right,
months basically. Like
right,
these guys take like a year to more than a
right,
year to get
right.
to full weight. So they're also
Mhm.
just more gentle and mellow in general. Not that they don't root, but they also have like shorter noses and stuff like that. So they don't dig as deep. They might like if you have like their favorite little root is down there, they're gonna go get it.
Mhm.
But
Yeah,
but generally speaking, they're just like gonna as long as you keep them moving and keep them from getting bored and they're not gonna start digging. They will everyone will root, like every pig will root. So it's not like
right, right.
they won't root, but they're a lot less destructive and
Yeah,
potentially don't even root if they're happy with the forage and everything and that can
yeah.
be more of the time than less of the time with those ones.
That's
But
cool.
it brings up the question for me is like if you brought a kuni kuni, for example, into your climate, what do you do with them? Since I think like one of the advantages to like a Gloucestershire or Old Spot or something like that is like you're harvesting in the fall. Like I mean, you're processing those, you're getting them in the spring and processing in the fall, and you don't have
Mhm.
to worry about what to do with pigs over the winter. But this, I guess, would apply to any of the animals in a cold climate like that. What are you doing in the winter when there is no grazing?
Mhm. I mean, that's in this climate, it's basically the proven strategy is put up a ton of hay and, feed out hay all winter and make a lot of compost and have a lot of good manure to feed back into the system. But,
Yeah,
you're storing grass.
yeah,
And
gotcha,
that's what's proven itself in this climate.
gotcha.
Um, and it's pretty
Big
hard to beat
big hay
that. I mean,
barn.
it's kind of old school. But people, when you're talking right in the beginning about resiliency in terms of, and like redundancy and reliability. And I mean, that's proven in this climate to be like pretty unbeatable in terms of just raw reliability. Now, in other climates, people in some climates are able to, stock. What do they call it? Like, stock forage. There's a word I'm blanking on. It's a little late in the day for me remembering all the words, but basically, put up a lot of forage grasses in the fall that's not grazed, and they'll dig through the snow and graze it. But here, people don't seem to be able to make that work because I think it's too wet. I've heard, and like I have super hardy cows, and they're not going through 2 feet of snow looking for like molding grass. Um, but in some even really cold places, I've heard they do it where it's drier and definitely in warmer, more mild places.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't know. Overwintering pigs isn't a very compelling idea to me,
Right, right,
unless they
exactly.
eat hay. Unless they would eat hay bales.
Yeah,
Um,
maybe. I don't know. Yeah, because then you have to buy all this feed, they're in one spot, and it seems less exciting.
Yeah.
Um, well, just digging in more into like this in depth with the grazing thing. Guard dogs, you've had some experience, and what are your thoughts working with guard dogs when you have grazing animals?
Yeah, I mean, my animals have largely been pets. I mean, they have kept chickens and ducks and geese alive, so they've had guardian roles, but they're not like living with the flock like a true LGD.
Right.
They're a real multi-purpose dog, including family member. So I
Which
hesitate to speak as like a livestock guardian dog, owner, because that's not me.
right.
But having just dogs that are outside a lot and are tuned into it, which our English shepherds are, um, is excuse me, is definitely helpful. They've
Yeah.
kept a lot of predators just at bay. They just push the predators out of zone 1, zone 2. Um, Not super needed with sheep around here, and although there is some predation of sheep, but so people do have true, LGDs in with their flock herds and flocks, but with cows, for instance, like we have 3 to 5 cows at any time, and like no livestock are not needed. I mean, they'll just run off any coyotes and stuff.
Right. Okay. Well, and just going back to fencing and stuff like that, I think the one thing I forgot that I really wanted to ask you about was, just having seen the layout and design of your place there, the in on the smaller site, you used a lot of, it looks like sort of like willow fencing or living fences or hedges as containment. Is that true? And
Hmm.
do you
Yeah,
recommend that? Do you
we've
have any advice
experimented with
about
that,
that?
but we haven't really used them on like all sides of a containment situation. I've like grazed up against a fence, a hedge that we've quickly laid, not like proper English style. Um,
Right, right.
so I can't. Yeah, I can't. I haven't done like real laid hedges, and that's why it's not in my book, like as a report on it like true English style or any properly laid hedges. We've planted a lot of hedges, and I am harvesting them for fuel wood now, for instance. But as far as like a livestock containment hedge, like a laid hedge, we haven't really done much of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always wondered if like you did like a willow fence or something like that, like a living fence, if like, something like a goat would just chew through it anyway and get out like, oh,
If
this
you
is
had
a
a
delicious
proper
fence.
like English laid hedge, like a full on pleached, landscape. I mean, in some ways, it's just a lot of work to set up. But I've had dreams where the optimal layout of like a smaller parcel, like I'm on right now,
Hmm.
where the bottom 6 acres of this site would be like a cellularized field with like eighth to maybe fifth acre paddocks that have permanent pleached laid hedge living fences
Yeah,
containing them all, and you just open a gate between them
yeah,
and bam, and just move them, no
yeah,
moving electronet, super mob stock, high density. But like to set all that up would be a lot of work. Um,
yeah.
but that would be awesome. But
That would be
yeah,
awesome.
it's like I don't know. That's like if you're full on peasant ag, like everyone's working all day on the farm on 5 acres, and you've got a big group, like that would be totally doable. But
Right,
um,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. And then you have to maintain that hedge too,
And then
right?
you got to maintain that exactly, or it's going to be 30 feet tall and shading everything out, or 50 feet tall. So, yeah, it's just like Ben Law, in England, the UK, Mark Krawczyk's done, who I teach with, a good friend of mine. He's experienced with that stuff a bit. But yeah, true British kind of peasant ag. That's awesome. I think there should be more of that in New England, but I think it's very labor intensive.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that you had 100 geese on the bigger property. Were you selling them when you harvested them? What?
Yeah, we did that in collaboration with some of our apprentices. So, yeah, between all of us, like some most of them that I had, like I was, getting 20 out of them out of the operation, and then they sold some. So they
Okay.
raised them on our land, and then I bought 20 of them basically.
Gotcha.
and they sold the rest. So they were able to like come up with buyers for 100 geese, but yeah, I don't know. There's not chefs looking for too many geese around here.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. I know it's yeah, probably everywhere. But
Yeah.
still, doesn't mean they shouldn't be. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
no, I think reviving the geese economy would be good for regenerative ag.
yeah. Well, I'm gonna go back to bees. I always thought bees were really easy to keep. I kept them in LA, but like it sounds like you're doing a little more labor intensive version. I just put out hives and
Yeah.
wild I mean, this is literally what I did. I bought hives, put them out, and made them attractive. Like, give them the right kind of morning light. And I used some like lemongrass and some other, there were flowers planted nearby. And wild bees moved in. And like a couple months later, they had filled the whole hive, and then we just started taking honey out. And it was that simple. And then they
Yeah.
like, and that
Yeah.
was it. Like I like once a month we'd go get some honey from these wild
Yeah,
bees
that's
that just moved
amazing. I
in.
mean, that's
It
how
was
I
like,
understood beekeeping was in all over, not that long ago, like prior to the Varroa mite being
uh-huh,
here. But we have strong mite populations in New England, and we have much wetter weather, which isn't good for bees. They really
uh-huh,
like Mediterranean climate. They want to, basically not. I mean, kind of the drier the better. They're flying, and nectar is really going off when it's dry, and not when it's like sobbing wet
right.
out all the
Yeah.
time.
They're kind of grumpy when
And
it's wet.
also
Yeah.
warmer. And so, in the mountains of New England, it seems like it's a pretty challenging thing, especially with the
Gotcha.
mites, but even
Gotcha.
climate wise too. So, yeah, that's great, down there. But like, I know super experienced beekeepers who will lose like half to 2/3 of all their colonies in a winter.
Well,
I mean, like imagine if like half your cows died one winter. You'd be like, all right, you're
right.
doing something wrong. Like you would
Right.
know what you're doing wrong. And this happens with your bees, and you
You
sometimes
have
even
no
hard to
idea.
tell what the heck happened. Like, and
Yeah.
then it's like, okay, this is difficult, because you don't
Right.
even know how to avoid that again from happening again. It's just like colony collapse disorder.
Right.
That's why CCD is a term. It's like it could be a lot of things,
Right.
and whatever it is, it's killing bees like crazy. And even people who are very experienced and not really abusing their bees, like a lot of the industrial system obviously does do, but even people are keeping pretty sensitively and like in a bee centric type of way, which I'm certainly doing. Like I don't use bought foundation from the industrial wax economy. I'm using naturally drawn frames. I'm not feeding sugar syrup. I'm not feeding bleach in their food. If I feed them anything to get them through a dearth, it's like it's honey from them that I saved from like the years before, giving them like
Right.
great homes, wind protection, and still it's pretty tricky.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's
Yeah.
funny. You just made me laugh because I remember talking to somebody about organic, like apple growing. And then they found out that I was like from California. They're like, well, it's a little different here. it's like,
Mhm.
it's like, no, I
Yeah,
know.
there's some things that are a lot harder out there, and some things that are definitely way easier, like growing like large fruit out there, or things that here would just fungus. But yeah, bees are tough here.
Yeah. Well, how do you measure a regenerative system? Like how do you measure regeneration?
I mean, I would say in some ways I measure it. I'm interested in measuring it a bit less than I used to be, because I just can see how lush and how
Hmm.
productive and biodiverse my systems are over time, and just having a sensitivity to, observing, those tendencies, is what it matters to me. And I kind of know it if it's going in the right direction or the wrong direction. And there's certainly some parts of my land, if I'm maybe grazing too hard or not greening up enough, or I can't say any of them are degenerating, but there's some areas that are not regenerating as fast as others. So I know what it looks like if it's not as optimal as it could be, and then I know what it looks like if it's really going good. And but yeah, it's kind of like what I put in my book, that you mentioned early on, the biodiversity amount of biomass produced. Those two
Hmm.
things, for the most part, is like how biodiverse is it and how much biomass is that area of land producing.
Yeah.
But then there's also, there's other things like how much is it absorbing stormwater flows? That's a key
Mm.
function, and banking water into the aquifer versus water running off. It's not going to be building much biomass or producing much biodiversity if it is shunting water, but it's worth mentioning. Um,
Right.
yeah, but I'm not actively trying to test my soil in all different plots all over the place. I mean, should I be? Sure, but I'm busy just doing everything that needs
Right.
to happen versus just the monitoring. Um, so yeah, like how much organic matter is being built in different areas. Like all I know is it's building, or
Yeah.
it's good. It's going the right direction, but that monitoring would be nice to do in more
Well, I
places.
mean,
Sure.
no, that's great. I mean, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty for not doing it.
Yeah, no, I
I
know, but I'm
yeah.
just kind of trying to be really transparent about kind of the info I have and the info I don't have.
Yeah, I mean, I like that you said lushness as the like what
Yeah,
you see. I think that's I mean, that is biodiversity and biomass, and
yeah.
maybe, I mean, maybe even deliciousness would be another element of it. Like,
Hmm.
is it more delicious every year?
Yeah, and
Um,
what's the land's capacity to regrow after for us the winter is the dormant season, and now you see pastures that are fertile. You see
yeah,
how fast the new growth has come. Like right now, you can drive around and there's pastures that are ready for cows. They're 4 inches of sward coming up. I mean, they're not completely ready, but there's food there. Like cows would be
right.
very happy on them. And then there's pastures where the just little sprigs of green grass coming out and there's nothing yet to eat, and even in the same microclimate. So
Yeah.
that's revealing the fertility of that ground. Sometimes there's a little bit of nitrogen inputs there that are doing that, but for the most part
Right.
it's like that's reflecting how good the soil is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I mean, just to, at the end of your book, I love the story that you tell about like picking the first apple from this tree that you had spent, 7 years, like you planted it and then mulched and weeded and tended it. And when you planted it, you kind of had this idea in your mind of like, one day it'll be great and I'll be able to eat the apples from this tree. And then when that day came, it was like a realization that the reward was all of those 7 years of work that you had done, and you didn't really care that much about the apple. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I'm just wondering. I mean, I guess if I would to turn this into a question, but like that story is, how would you put that in your own words in terms of like how would you suggest people move forward, given
Hmm.
sort of what we started with, the state of the world.
Hmm. Yeah, I wish I had easy answers or prescriptions, but I think when people just start working with the land that they're on, their land base, a lot of good things start to happen that increase their resiliency and their happiness and their joy and their health, and they're somewhat unpredictable, and the yields are going to be different than one might expect them to be. Some might be similar and some might be totally different, but it's just always a really worthwhile journey, if you want to improve your life and also if you want to increase your resiliency, especially if you want to do both. And, there's going to be a mysterious journey that unfolds for, each person that does that. And the more time you are able to really put into that, I think the more you kind of experience those values and kind of glean that magic from the experience. I think just the challenge is a lot of people just don't have the time, to do that, to wake up and spend the day in where they live and not get in the car and have to go somewhere and be running around. And that's, really unfortunate part of our reality now. But if whatever people can do to break that cycle so they can actually wake up, put their hands in the ground and on trees and on the land all around them, making things, tending to the place, go to sleep without having to get in their car, that becomes, that a process that just starts reinforcing itself, and you start figuring out how to create a life around that rhythm. I'm not saying that's everyone should do that necessarily, or it's the right way for everyone, but what I've seen is anyone who's able to try to get that rhythm going, really starts to reorganize their life to be able to do that with as many days of the year as possible, and it does essentially result in them becoming healthier, happier people, stronger, more resilient, and really ultimately offering more to their community in terms of like resources and skills and know-how. That's kind of the resilient culture piece there, and that comes from that. But yeah, obviously the economy makes that very hard to do, and it's not a simple. Doesn't feel terribly accessible sometimes. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, your book is called The Resilient Farm and Homestead. Is there a website or anything that you want to put out there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we keep up with our website lately, wholesystemsdesign.com, and I try to share a lot of stuff on my Instagram and things that inspire me. There's a lot of things that aren't in the book, although the book is a good starting place. I try to offer a lot of other insights that I have in my work with land on some of my YouTube and Instagram, and on the website to some extent. And we do some online courses too. We're rolling out more and more over there of those. So that's also another way to stay in touch with kind of the findings that we're having here.
Cool. Do you need apprentices? Do you put out a call at certain times of the year? How's that work?
Yeah, we work with apprentices every spring. We just ended this year's apprenticeship, and a week ago, and it's really just an 8-day intensive program right now. It's always filled, so I don't, sure. I mean, if the people are hearing this, they're interested, get in touch. There's a page on my website, but we always, have more than we need in terms of interest. But it's an awesome experience and totally hands-on. And then our permaculture course is every year in August, and that is more of like, it's pretty hands-on too, but it's also philosophical, theoretical framework immersion of permaculture design and going through the design process of working on a site, the site planning, assessment, and design, schematic design process, the overlay process, and so that's our flagship really offering, is every August. That happens for 10 days, and
Okay,
like
great.
30 to 40 students come from all over the world to that, and it's super fun and great experience every year.
Oh, that sounds great. Very cool. Well, Ben, thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this and sharing all this stuff that you have figured out over the last couple decades.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for your interest. It's my pleasure that people are interested in it, and gives me a lot of hope that there is interest in this. So thanks for your time, and look forward to being in touch.
Yeah.